May 17, 1944, 11:47 a.m., port of Boston, Massachusetts. The hull of the converted Liberty ship USS General WW2 groaned against the pier as longshoremen secured the gangway. Below deck, in the dim steel belly of the vessel, 847 German prisoners of war sat in silence. The Atlantic crossing had taken 19 days. The men, Panzer Grenadiers from the 21st Panzer Division, Volkskolmgar from Monte Cassino, U-boat crews pulled from the North Atlantic, had expected darkness. They had expected barbed wire, starvation rations, interrogation rooms lit by single bulbs. They had been told in the final weeks of training before deployment that capture by the Americans meant humiliation, forced labor in frozen forests, perhaps execution. Goebbels himself had promised it on the radio. The Anglo-American beast will show no mercy. Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, broadcast transcript, March 1944. And so they sat, breathing the smell of diesel and sweat, listening to the boots of American MP echo down the corridor, waiting for the doors to open. When they did, the sunlight was blinding. They climbed the stairs in single file, blinking against the glare. The first thing they saw was the sky, wide, unbroken, the blue of a world untouched by war. Then the harbor. No craters, no twisted steel. The piers stretched in neat rows, cranes lifting crates stamped with U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, forklifts moving in choreographed lines. There was no rubble. There were no ruins. And then as they were marched down the gangway onto American soil, they saw the cars, hundreds of them, parked in neat rows along the waterfront, gleaming under the spring sun, Fords, Chevrolets, Dodges, painted in colors they had not seen in years. Civilian workers moved between them, eating sandwiches, drinking from thermoses, laughing. Not one of them looked up at the prisoners. One young sergeant from Dusseldorf, captured at Anzio, would later describe the moment in an interrogation transcript. "We thought it was a trick, a film set." Propaganda. No country at war could look like this. U.S. Army Intelligence Service, POW interview collection, June 1944. They were loaded onto buses, clean upholstered with windows that opened. The convoy moved west, through streets lined with storefronts displaying goods the men had not seen since 1939. Butcher shops with sides of beef hanging in the windows, bakeries with towers of bread, clothing stores with mannequins dressed in wool coats and leather shoes. Children rode bicycles. Women pushed strollers. The buses passed a Texaco station where a man in coveralls was washing a Buick, whistling. A captured Luftwaffe navigator shot down over Schweinfurt, pressed his face to the glass and whispered to the man beside him, "They are not rationed. They are not even touched." Oz Morale Operations Branch Field Report, May 1944. The realization moved through the bus like a shockwave. Germany was losing. Not because of tactics, not because of courage, but because the enemy lived in a world where war was an abstraction, a distant thunder, something happening to someone else. The camps themselves deepened the shock. Camp Mexia, Texas. Camp Como, Mississippi. Camp Alva, Oklahoma. They were not camps in the European sense. They were small towns. Rows of white-painted barracks with pitched roofs and window screens. Mess halls that served 3 meals a day. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, milk, coffee, apple pie. Portions larger than what German civilians were receiving under ration cards. The men gained weight. Their uniforms, threadbare from months in North Africa or Italy, were replaced with clean fatigue stamped PW in white letters. They were issued razors, soap, toothbrushes, writing paper. They were allowed to send letters home, 1 per week, censored but delivered. They played soccer in the evenings, organized orchestras, staged theater productions. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, prisoners built a miniature replica of a German village, complete with a church steeple and a working fountain. Using scrap lumber provided by the camp administration, War Department, Prisoner of War Operations Division, Inspection Report, August 1944. American guards watched bemused as the men sang folk songs in the evenings, their voices drifting across the plains. But the strangeness was not in the comfort. It was in the abundance, the casual, almost careless excess that surrounded. Every morning, trucks arrived at the camps loaded with supplies, flour, sugar, canned goods, cigarettes, chocolate. The prisoners were assigned to work details, and here the dissonance became unbearable. They picked cotton in Mississippi, harvested wheat in Kansas, worked in canneries in California. They saw the fields, endless mechanized work by machines they had only heard about in technical journals. John Deere combines rolling across horizons that seem to stretch forever. American farmers who owned more land than entire German villages, who drove tractors with V8 engines, and lived in houses with electric refrigerators and indoor plumbing. At a lumber camp in Oregon, a captured Wehrmacht corporal watched a crane lift a Douglas fir trunk, 4 feet thick, 60 feet long, onto a flatbed truck in under 2 minutes. He wrote to his wife in a letter intercepted and translated by U.S. censors, "I do not know how we ever believed we could win. They have everything. We have nothing. National Archives, RG 389, POW Correspondence Files, September 1944. The men began to whisper. In the barracks at night, in the mess halls, in the fields during water breaks. They compared notes. They shared observations. The factory worker from Essen, who had been assigned to a steel mill in Pennsylvania and seen furnaces producing more in a single day than Krupp could manage in a month. The farm boy from Bavaria, who had picked oranges in Florida and realized that a single grove produced more fruit than his entire district back home. The U-boat officer who had watched from the deck of a prison transport as the New York skyline appeared on the horizon, towers of steel and glass rising higher than any building in Berlin, untouched, unafraid, lit up in defiance of every blackout regulation he had ever known. They began to understand. The war was not being fought on battlefields. It was being fought in factories, in farms, in the living rooms of a people who had never seen a bomb fall, who had never known hunger, who could afford to feed their prisoners better than Germany could feed its own soldiers. The revelation was crushing, and it was only the beginning. The secret was not hidden in vaults or locked behind guarded doors. It was everywhere, plain and visible, so vast that it took weeks for the prisoners to comprehend its scale. America's advantage was not a weapon. It was not a tactic. It was capacity, industrial, agricultural, logistical capacity so overwhelming that the entire German war machine, stretched across 2 fronts and bleeding from 1,000 wounds, could not match even a fraction of it. By 1944, the United States was producing 96,318 aircraft per year, more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Statistical Appendix, 1946. It was launching a new Liberty ship every 42 days, welding together 2,700 tons of steel on assembly lines that ran 24 hours without pause. It was manufacturing 17,500 M4 Sherman tanks in a single year, rolling them off lines in Detroit, Cleveland, and Grand Blanc, Michigan, factories staffed by workers who had been building automobiles 18 months earlier. War Production Board, Annual Report, 1944. Prisoners saw the results. They did not yet understand the engine. They learned. At Camp Huntsville, Texas, a group of captured tank officers was assigned to repair duty at a nearby Army depot. Their task was to refurbish damaged Shermans returned from Europe. On the first day, a convoy of flatbed trucks arrived carrying 37 tanks, scorched, punctured, tracks blown, turrets jammed. The prisoners examined them with professional interest. Most bore impacts from 75 and 88 rounds. Several had burned. One had taken a Panzerfaust to the glacis plate and the entire front hull had buckled. In the Wehrmacht, these tanks would have been stripped for parts and abandoned. Here, the American sergeant in charge handed out welding torches and cutting tools and said, simply, fix them. The prisoners stayed. One, a former Panzer IV commander captured at Kasserine Pass, asked through an interpreter how long they had to complete the work. The sergeant shrugged. 2 weeks, maybe 3, doesn't matter. We've got more coming. U.S. Army Ordnance Department, POW Labor Utilization Report, July 1944. The German looked at the row of battered Shermans and felt something close to vertigo. More coming, always more. The technical manuals told the rest of the story. Prisoners with engineering backgrounds were allowed access to training documents, partly to assist with repairs, partly because American intelligence wanted to observe their reaction. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, a former Krupp machinist named Eric Hartman was handed a copy of Technical Manual TM 9731A, the maintenance guide for the M4A3 Sherman. He read it in silence for 20 minutes. Then he closed it, set it on the table, and spoke to the American officer present. "This is not a tank. This is a product, OAS Field Report, Psychological Warfare Division, August 1944. The distinction was everything. German tanks, the Panther, the Tiger, the Ferdinand, were feats of engineering. Hand-fitted, precision-machined, requiring hundreds of man-hours and specialized tools. A single Tiger I needed 300,000 man-hours. To produce its Maybach HL230 engine, crafted by skilled machinists who had trained for years, Bundesarchiv, Warproof 6 production records, 1943. The Sherman needed 10,000 man-hours. Its components were interchangeable. Its tracks could be replaced in 30 minutes. Its engine, a Ford Garvey derived from a passenger car design, could be swapped out in the field with basic tools. Chrysler Tank Arsenal Production Records, 1943. It was designed not for excellence, but for mass. And mass was the point. The numbers became inescapable. By mid-1944, the United States was producing more war material in a single month than Germany produced in an entire year. The prisoners learned this from eavesdropping, from fragments of newspaper articles, from the casual conversations of guards who saw no reason to conceal it. At Camp Applica, Alabama, a group of prisoners listened through a barracks wall as two American soldiers discussed production quotas. Quote, "Plant 3 just hit 900 Shermans this month," one said. "Beat Plant 2 by 50. The Germans translated the conversation, checked the math, and sat in stunned silence. 900 tanks in 1 month from one factory. Germany's entire 1943 tank production, Panzer IV, Panthers, Tigers, Stu GS combined, was 12,063 vehicles. Reichsministerium für Rüstung und Kriegsproduction, final tally, December 1943. America built 29,497 tanks in 1943 alone, and most of them reached the front intact, supported by fuel trucks, ammo carriers, and repair crews that moved in unbroken supply lines, stretching back across an ocean that no U-boat could seriously threaten. Arsenal of Democracy Summary Report, 1944. The disbelief turned to something harder, to despair. At Camp Livingston, Louisiana, a false Commis-Égale lieutenant named Klaus Becker was assigned to a cotton harvest detail. On the third day, the American foreman drove up in a red farmel tractor pulling a mechanical picker that could process 8 rows at once. Becker watched it work for an hour. Then he asked the foreman, through an interpreter, how many men it replaced. "Maybe 30, the foreman said. "Maybe 40, the foreman said. "Maybe 4. "Depends." Becker nodded slowly. That night, he wrote in a journal that would later be confiscated and catalogued by camp intelligence. "We are fighting the 19th century against the 20th. We are cavalry against tanks. It does not matter how brave we are. It does not matter how well we are trained. We are obsolete." National Archives, RG 389, Power Personal Effects, November 1944. The sentiment spread. It moved through the camps like a slow poison. Not defeatism exactly. Something colder. Recognition. And then came the battle stories. American guards, bored or boastful, shared them freely. At Camp Shanks, New York, a returned infantry sergeant described the destruction of the 21st Panzer Division at Eaucourt, France, in September 1944. He was not a historian. He did not know unit designations or technical details. He simply described what he had seen. They came at us in Panthers. Big, heavy, beautiful machines. Our Shermans lit them up from 3 sides. We lost a dozen tanks. They lost 50. We had replacements by morning. They didn't. U.S. Army 4th Armored Division After Action Report, September 1944. The prisoners knew Eaucourt. Some had been there. They knew the 21st Panzer Division had been rebuilt 3 times since Normandy, each time weaker, each time with fewer experienced crews, each time throwing untrained boys into machines that took months to replace. The Americans lost tanks every day, and every day more arrived. That was the battle. Not Panther versus Sherman, not tactics versus tactics, abundance versus scarcity, time versus desperation. The real blow came from the air. Prisoners who had served in the Luftwaffe or who had survived under Allied air superiority understood it viscerally. At Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, a former Bf-109 pilot named Otto Lindemann was shown a training film meant for American bomber crew. It was routine, unremarkable. Footage of a B-17 formation assembling over England, 300 aircraft stacked in boxes, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, flying east toward targets in the Ruhr. Lindemann watched in silence. When it ended, he asked the American projectionist a single question: "How many bombers do you have?" The answer: "In Europe, about 5,000 heavy bombers. Give or take, 8th Air Force Statistical Summary, October 1944. Lindemann's face went blank. The Luftwaffe, at its peak in 1940, had fielded 3,500 combat aircraft across all types: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance, transports. Luftwaffe Quartermaster General, Strength Report, September 1940. By 1944, it could barely muster 1,000 operational fighters on any given day. And the Americans had 5,000 heavy bombers, just the bombers, not counting fighters, not counting the 9th Air Force or the RAF, or the tactical squadrons or the replacement aircraft, sitting in depots. Lindemann said nothing. He stood, walked out of the hall, and spent the rest of the day sitting alone under a tree, staring at the sky. The prisoners began to speak openly now, in letters and in camp discussions monitored by U.S. intelligence officers fluent in German. They used the same words again and again, unmerglich. Impossible, impossible to win, impossible to compete. Impossible to comprehend how a nation could be this rich, this productive, this unbound, and still be growing stronger. At Camp Concordia, a captured colonel named Dieter Voss was interviewed by an OSS officer. The transcript records his words exactly. "You have defeated us with your factories, your women rivet bombers. Your farmers drive machines that do the work of 100 men. Your prisoners eat better than our soldiers. How can we win? We are fighting a nation that does not even feel the war." OSS Research and Analysis Branch, interview transcript, November 1944. The officer filed the report. The words were true, and they would be repeated in different forms by thousands of prisoners across hundreds of camps until the pattern became undeniable. The war was over. The Germans had simply not realized it yet. The psychological collapse began in the fields and workshops, but it accelerated when the prisoners were allowed access to American newspapers and radio broadcasts. By late 1944, camp regulations had relaxed. Prisoners could attend English classes, watch films, listen to carefully selected news programs. The intent was re-education, a soft introduction to democratic ideals, a counterweight to Nazi ideology. War Department, Provost Marshal General's Office, Re-Education and Reorientation Program, Policy Memo, October 1944. The effect was something simpler and more devastating. The prisoners learned how badly they were losing. They read about the fall of Paris, the encirclement of the Ruhr, the collapse of Army Group Center. They heard Edward R. Murrow describe the bombing of Berlin in calm, measured tones, and they knew, because they had lived through it, that every word was true. The guards did not gloat. They did not need to. The facts were enough. At Camp Perry, Ohio, a group of Waffen-SS prisoners refused to believe reports of German retreats on the Eastern Front. They insisted it was Allied propaganda. A sympathetic American chaplain, himself a German immigrant, brought them a copy of the New York Times dated December 12, 1944, with a front-page map showing Soviet forces within 100 miles of Berlin. One of the prisoners, a former squad leader from the 1st SS Panzer Division, studied the map for a long time. Then he folded the paper, handed it back, and said in halting English, "Then it is finished. Camp Perry Intelligence Summary, December 1944. He was not angry. He sounded tired. Relieved, almost, as if the certainty of defeat was easier to bear than the false hope they had carried across the ocean. The human cost of the secret advantage was rarely discussed by the prisoners, but it was visible everywhere. At Camp Landing, Florida, a work detail of German PO was assigned to unload supply trucks arriving from a nearby port. The trucks carried rations, canned beef, powdered eggs, coffee, sugar, chocolate bars. The prisoners worked in silence, stacking crates in a warehouse that stretched the length of 2 football fields. One of them, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg named Friedrich Neumann, calculated the volume of food passing through his hands in a single day. He estimated it was enough to feed 10,000 men for a week. He asked the American supply sergeant where it was going. "Replacement depot," the sergeant said. "New guys heading to Europe." Neumann nodded. He did not ask how many replacement depots there were, or how many new guys, or how the United States could afford to feed them all. He already knew Camp Blanding Quartermaster log, January 1945. Behind the abundance was an army of workers the prisoners never saw. The riveters at the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where the B-24 Liberator assembly line stretched for more than a mile and produced one bomber every 63 minutes, Ford Motor Company, War Production Records, 1944. The welders at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, where Liberty ships were launched in as little as 4 days from keel laying to christening, a pace that broke every maritime construction record in history. U.S. Maritime Commission, Statistical Report, 1945. The women in overalls and headscarves who made up 36% of the wartime workforce by 1945 and built the tanks, planes, ships and guns that the Wehrmacht could not answer. War Manpower Commission, Employment Statistics, 1945. The farmers who planted 16 million additional acres between 1940 and 1944, using tractors and combines and chemical fertilizers to increase yields by 20%, ensuring that no American soldier and no German prisoner ever went hungry. U.S. Department of Agriculture, Wartime Production Summary, 1945. The truck drivers who hauled it all, the railroads that moved 2.5 billion tons of freight in 1944 alone, the dock workers who loaded onto ships, the merchant marine crews who risked U-boats to deliver it, Association of American Railroads, Annual Report, 1944. The entire nation mobilized and synchronized, producing on a scale that no totalitarian state, no matter how ruthless or efficient, could hope to match. The prisoners were released slowly in waves, beginning in 1945 and continuing into 1946. Some went home to cities that no longer existed. Others found their families scattered, missing, dead. But almost all of them carried the same memory. The memory of arriving in a country that was at war and did not look like it, that fed them and clothed them and put them to work in fields and factories that seemed to stretch forever, that built machines faster than they could be destroyed, that lived in a world of light and noise and abundance while Europe burned. Years later, in interviews conducted by historians and journalists, the former prisoners would struggle to explain what they had felt. Otto Lindemann, the Luftwaffe pilot, described it in 1983. "We were not defeated by soldiers. We were defeated by a civilization. They had everything. We had will. Will is not enough." German War Veterans Association, Oral History Project, 1983. The lesson was not lost on post-war military strategists. The American model, mass production, interchangeable parts, supply chain dominance, total industrial mobilization, became the foundation of NATO doctrine during the Cold War. The Mohn Abrams tank, the F-15 Eagle, the Nimitz-class carrier, all descendants of the same philosophy that built the Sherman, the B-17, and the Liberty ship: build more, build faster, overwhelmed through abundance. The Soviet Union tried to match it and collapsed under the war. China studied it and adapted. The Gulf War, in 1991, was a demonstration of the same principle, a force so technologically superior, so logistically supported, so crushingly abundant, that the outcome was never in doubt. Department of Defense, Operation Desert Storm, final report to Congress, 1992. But the real legacy was psychological. At Camp Como, Mississippi, in the final weeks of the war, an American officer asked a group of prisoners what they would tell their families when they returned home. One of them, 19-year-old private from Saxony, answered without hesitation that we fought the future, and the future won. Camp Como Final Disposition Report, May 1945. It was a dramatized composite, but the sentiment was documented again and again in interrogation files, in censored letters, in the diaries of men who had crossed the Atlantic expecting darkness and found instead the blazing light of a nation they could not comprehend and could not defeat. They had seen America at war, And what they had seen was not cruelty or vengeance or even military brilliance. They had seen surplus. Surplus food, surplus steel, surplus fuel, surplus mercy, surplus everything. And in that surplus they had seen the future of warfare. That wars are won not by heroes or tactics or wonder weapons, but by the grinding, inexorable weight of industrial capacity, by the ability to produce faster than the enemy can destroy, to replace losses before they are even counted, to fight not with desperation, but with the calm confidence of a power that has already won and is simply waiting for the other side to realize it. The prisoners realized it in the spring sun of a Boston harbor, in the cotton fields of Texas, in the gleaming rows of automobiles parked along an American street. They realized it, and they went home, and they never forgot.